Hello everyone! Welcome to our devotional series, Season 2, Worship Adventure, Lesson 1, God is Compassionate.
If you tried to describe what God is like, it could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently described God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. The very first word used in this description of God is compassionate, or in Hebrew, rachum. This word also appears as a noun, rachamim, or compassion. And what's fascinating is that both of these words are related to the Hebrew word for womb, rechem. So compassion in the Hebrew Bible is centered in a person's core, and the word invites us to imagine a mother's tender feelings for her vulnerable infant. So rahum is a word that conveys intense emotion. Sometimes it's even translated as deeply moved, like in the story of King Solomon, who meets two women who've just given birth. One of their babies sadly dies, but then both women claim that the baby still living is theirs. As a test, Solomon says to cut the baby in two and give each mother a half. And the baby's real mother is deeply moved. She would rather the other woman take her baby than see her child die. And it's her compassion that reveals that she's the true mother. But rahum isn't just an emotional word. It also involves action. And surprisingly, the word is used most often to describe God's actions, motivated by his emotions. Like when the Israelites are suffering and oppressed in Egypt, God hears their cries and is compelled by his compassion, his rachamim, to rescue them. Then, as the Israelites travel through the dangerous wilderness, they're hungry and thirsty, and God is rachum, caring for them as his own child. He provides everything they need: food, water, and clothing, as he personally guides them. So it's no surprise that when Yahweh reveals his character to the Israelites in the wilderness, he begins by saying he's compassionate. But despite Yahweh's continual rachamim, the Israelites turn away from him time and again. They reject Yahweh's compassion and instead give their allegiance to other gods. And rather than showing compassion to each other, they do violence. And their rebellion results in exile, and they're scattered among the nations. And it's in this dark moment in Israel's story that we come to the book of Isaiah, where Yahweh compares himself to a mother full of rachamim toward her baby. He says, "Can a mother forget her nursing child, or have no compassion or rachamim on the child of her womb? Even if she forgets, I will not forget you." God is full of motherly compassion, and he will rescue his people. And as you read further in Isaiah, you realize that God is going to do this by entering into the suffering of humanity. And this points forward to a time when Jesus comes on the scene. He is Yahweh's deep compassion become human. In Greek, the word compassion is oiktirmos. And as Jesus embraces the sick and cares for the outcast, he is deeply moved by human suffering. Jesus compares himself to a mother hen using her wings to shield her chicks from danger as he gathers people into his embrace. And in the ultimate expression of oiktirmos, Jesus is moved by compassion to enter into humanity's suffering, into death itself, to rescue and bring us near to God. And it's this same life of compassion that Jesus calls his followers to imitate, allowing ourselves to be moved by the pain of others, to embrace the hurting, and to participate in relieving suffering in the world. In this way, we too can embody the compassion of Yahweh, or in Jesus' words, be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. Now you can see how fitting it is that compassionate is the first word God uses to describe himself. So when we're in pain or see others suffering, we can be certain that God is deeply moved to respond, and that he's there to meet us with his deep compassion.
To know God produces compassion in the human heart. God's unfailing love for people is compassionate. We are familiar with the word compassion and even the feeling of pity or great distress for the suffering or misfortune of another. We promise to pray for them. Yet in reality, many times we forget to even do that while distancing ourselves from the situation. The Latin root word for compassion means to suffer with, hardly a concept driven by today's society of selfishness and self-preservation. The definition of compassion is a feeling of distress or pity for the suffering or misfortune of another, with a desire to alleviate it. To better understand God's expectation of compassion in His children, it is important to understand God's compassion. His unconditional love for mankind drove God to alleviate the penalty of sin in their life. God is the Father of all. God's love is marked by mercy and compassion for all of His creation. As a child of God, this becomes a believer's definition of love as well. Compassion is characteristics of God because of His love. The Lord is good to everyone. Is this how we treat the people that we meet? So let's talk about the Christ-like compassion. In Matthew 14:14, and when Jesus went out, He saw a great multitude, and He was moved with compassion for them, and healed their sick. In Matthew 30:34, so Jesus had compassion and touched their eyes, and immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed Him. In Matthew 1:41, then Jesus said, moved with compassion, stretched out His hand and touched him, and said to him, I am willing to be cleansed. Mark 6:34, and Jesus, when He came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So He began to teach them many things. In Luke 7:13-14, when the Lord saw her, He had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Then He came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried Him stood still. And He said, young man, I say to you, arise. The story of the good man Samaritan in Luke 10 is very touching and sobering, full of reality and truth and lessons for each of us. Luke 10:25-37, and behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested Him, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, what is written in the law? What is your reading of it? So he answered and said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have answered rightly. Do this and you will live. But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Then Jesus answered and said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departing, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked, and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him and bandaged him his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you." So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him, who fell among the thieves? And he said, "He who showed mercy on him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Let's talk about Christ-like compassion in this story. So number 1, Christ-like compassion sees on verse 33. And it states that, "But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. And when he saw him," so it sees. Do you see those around who you are suffering? Or do you turn away and pretend not to see? That's the question. Next, Christ-like compassion is, it can feel. So verse 33, "But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion." It feels. Are you touched by the suffering you see? Or have you closed yourself from feeling compassion? Number 3 is Christ-like compassion acts. Verse 34, "So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him." So it acts. Do you act upon the compassion feel? Or do you think, "Oh well, someone else will help them"? Next, Christ-like compassion in this story is Christ-like compassion cost. Verse 35, "On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, 'Take care of him, and whatever you spend, when I come again, I will repay you.'" Are you willing to pay for the cost that compassion demands? Or do you tell yourself that it's their own fault and you have better ways to spend your money? Lastly, Christ-like compassion learns. Verses 36 to 37. "So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him, who fell among the thieves?" And he said, "He who showed mercy on him." So on this story, he learns that he who showed mercy on him is the true neighbor. So have you learned these lessons of compassion from this story? Or are you willing to start practicing it in your life? Jesus concludes, "Go and do likewise." God is compassionate.
Slow to